Golan's absolutely right. My name is Julian Bleecker. I have this kind of confusing entity called the Near Future Laboratory, which is a bit of a bit, but it's also a very serious place where essentially conversations happen amongst some friends and colleagues and people with shared interests in envisioning new possible worlds. And mostly we do that through design, through technology, through art, and a lot of just heavy thinking. Definitely a lot of making going on there. And this was basically, it was set up, I mean, it's completely informal. It's mostly represented by a blog that I mostly write on and then sort of connect to other people and ideas and that kind of thing. I'm also a designer. I was told I can call myself that. For a while I was very nervous about it because wow, I have a design degree. I'm an electrical engineer and computer scientist, and I did some weird philosophy stuff. But after 2 years in this fantastic design studio at Nokia in Los Angeles, the guy who sits next to me basically said, stop playing around. Just you're a designer. That's what you're doing. It's okay. So what I wanted to talk to you about today is this just a little bit of I guess you might call it a meme of some sort, or a concept or an idea that a whole bunch of people have been sort of punting around on the networks, and that's this idea of design fiction. And the idea behind it is that there can be a way in which, instead of doing just science fiction, which is something that I'm sure a lot of us here are have some kind of association, relationship, or kinship, or fandom about. Think about the ways in which you might put design in there instead of, or also with the idea of science fiction. So effectively just kind of muddying all these barriers and these boundaries between all these things here. So like, in this case, I'll be mostly focusing on mobile phone, and then design, and then science, and then fact, and then fiction. And just kind of working through what these ideas might be and how an approach to doing design and creating new things and doing this invention thing that a lot of us think about, how we might approach it in a different way and why we might approach it, not so much as the creation of facts or the creation of products or these kinds of things, but as creations of ideas in our head that get expressed in material form. And I'll give you some examples of what I mean by that. So that's what this is. Some thoughts about design as something that can shape the future, bring about change, and craft new sorts of habitable worlds. So I want to give you some representations of the future, the ways in which the future is represented to us and ways in which we might represent it in our own head and understand it and conceive of it. So the first one is probably a lot of you are familiar with this kind of the up and to the right future. So everything is going to go up and to the right. More, bigger, more powerful, smaller, but that's always up and to the right because you just change the scale on the other side. But there's this linear sort of progression as we move forward through time. I think this is probably captured in this Buckminster Fuller quote. It says, "You never change things by fighting the existing reality. To change something, build a new model that makes the existing model obsolete." So this is a classic kind of thing that a big, Bucky Fuller fan. This idea that if the graph doesn't keep going up and to the right, just change the scales, move it around a little bit. Another quote, you'll be familiar with this one, by William Gibson. He says, "As I've said many times before, the future is here, it's just not evenly distributed." And this is kind of I call it the sandwich spread theory of the future. There's too much over here, let's move it over into, hey, Africa. That's always good, that plays well with people. Let's move some of our technology over there. Let them see our wonderful future that we've created in this one little office park in Menlo. Here's the third one. I only have a diagram. I don't have a quote yet because I haven't found the right one. It's somewhere out there. I'm sure people are sort of playing around with other ways of imagining the future. I'm actually a huge Bruno Latour fan, for those of you who sort of follow the work of the people who do sociology and science studies, and sociology of science and technology. There's something in there, he's just got such a wonderful sort of opus of work that it's hard to kind of pull the right one out. But thinking about the future as something that comes about in a more messy way. So it's not a nice linear graph where Intel's making things smaller and smaller and smaller and faster and faster and faster. It's more about all these very convoluted, controversial, messy conversations that happen in and around specific ideas that together sort of come together in different ways, splinter off and move into different directions. And something that I, as I participate much more and more in the DIY community, you begin to see these sorts of things. You begin to see like these moments where something comes from a number of different places. It might be like an idea that came from a story someone read and linked somehow to a little Arduino sketch that someone has put together and tied in together with the way someone decided to represent the project in a creative way, stuffing it into a teddy bear or something like this. And you see all these little messy bits and pieces coming together so that you identify new ideas and new knowledge and new practices coming not so much from that office park in Palo Alto or whatever, but coming from a whole bunch of different places simultaneously, bumping up against each other, and very much a decentered model of where ideas come from and how they propagate, how they spread, and how they move around the world. So in this model, the future is messy, and it's also handmade. It's something that wasn't brought to us by an alien ship crashing from someplace else, or brought on high from some noble university researcher who has the privilege to see out into the future and bring it back to us. It's something that we all do and we all participate in. And I think that politically, this is a much more useful model for understanding where the future comes from. So messy works for me. I love things when they're in the moment of their molten state, when they're being made, when the wires aren't sure exactly where they should go, when the wires change the meaning of what you've been doing, when you start pulling things apart and they become something else. And that molten state is very much like those moments when things could possibly swerve in different directions. So no one has figured out everything precisely. They're not saying this is exactly where we're going to get to. Things bump up against other kinds of challenges, other controversies. They pull ideas from a variety of different projects and work, different people's ways of thinking about the world, and form and infect and shape all these kinds of things so that you are always in a state of possibility. And it's important to consider that state of possibility. Things can be other than they are now. And that sense of possibility leads us into areas where we can create new things, things that are other than the expected up and to the right, or of course, yes, the new computer is smaller and it's faster and it costs $100 less, which is a much less interesting model of creating new kinds of worlds made than the unexpected things that pop in from the side. So what are ways in which the future is handmade? Obviously, because I'm thinking about this notion of design fiction, I'm thinking very much also about science fiction. Big science fiction buff, I've been since I was a little kid, probably like everyone here. And I'm very curious about what it is about science fiction that drew me in and that continues to draw me in. What is it about these movies? Some of them are complete crap, but still there are these moments where you're like, I'm watching this and I'm engaged somehow, either in what the character's doing or what this little bit of speculative technology suggests to me, or that moment where you're kind of like, wait a minute, pause, and you start working on something else. Because that idea has kind of infected you and shaped the way in which you're thinking. And I'm quite jealous of people who do really good science fiction, because I think they're doing the kind of work that myself and I think very many other people, probably a lot of people here, would also be able to do, which is expressing these ideas in our imagination and doing it in such an effective and compelling way that you can't put the book down, or you can't stop watching the movie, or you can't help but tell a friend to watch it and look at this scene, like, isn't this so cool? I'm also really jealous, mostly, special effects artists. And there was a while when I wanted to be a special effects artist, and I wanted to be one so bad that when I was doing my Ph.D., I basically did an ethnography of special effects artists so that I could just spend time with them and see how they do what they do. And that ability to creatively fashion a visual rendering of some entirely otherworldly place and do it with such artistic skill and such craft was something that I really wanted to learn how to do. I'm an engineer, so basically I wanted to bring that same sensibility to the work that I do when I build things. Like, how can I articulate these ideas that are in my head that sometimes just don't come out of my mouth as words? How can I do it in the material that I'm able to work with? So to give you a better idea of what I mean by all this crosstalk and this messy kind of noisy interplay, one of my favorite examples, there are a ton of them, but just given time, I'll just give you one or two, is the Minority Report interface. And what I found interesting about this particular messy world of what the Minority Report interface is that you could very easily sort of unpack all the complexities of where these ideas and how these ideas form and how they circulate and inform each other by doing, essentially looking through it and looking through the technology that was proposed in the film as a bit of fiction, looking through the moment of production of the film, how that technology came to be in terms of the production moment of the film, that is when they're making the film, like, how are we going to do this? What are we going to do and how are we going to make this happen? And I borrowed this from a colleague of mine called David Kirby. He teaches at Duke, and he's in the Science and Technology Studies department there. And I've learned an exceptional amount from him just about how those things happen, how science and film interplay. He likes to look at the ways in which, you know, he doesn't go as far as this, but I will because I don't have to go up to Kenya. The ways in which Hollywood is actually the vehicle through which our futures are imagined and created. So in order to unpack this very simple kind of DIY technique for doing this kind of inquiry, you just basically turn to the Google and you type in minority report interface and you see what you get back. And when you type it in, you begin to see things that you might expect. So first of all, you get the film. So you see a couple of results from Google Images showing some stills from the film. But then you get all these other wonderful things that come right up into it. And so that kind of entanglement is represented right at that front page of Google. You don't have to go too far, and you don't have to ask anyone what came first or what didn't. You just start using Google to kind of trace those lines of inquiry. And you see the film in the middle, and you see a bit of science with someone saying, someone obviously, their little science visualization has been associated with minority report interface because Google doesn't lie and someone tagged it that way or something. And then you have underneath that, you have Jeff Hahn giving his demonstration at TED, I think it was in 2006, of his touch interface device, which got a lot of big attention, but it's right up there, so it's not tagged as Jeff Hahn shows us fascinating new research from NYU. It's tagged as minority report becomes reality. And that really slippery path between this research that Jeff Hahn's doing and the science fiction film, between fact and fiction, is all collapsed in that one line right there. And then you can kind of keep going through and you get more and more of this kind of stuff, where Minority Report, the film, becomes the central kind of organizing expression that collapses all this work and all this interest and all this activity in this idea of a new kind of interface paradigm. So from this, kind of moving quickly, you see that in some way, you might suppose, and I'll try to argue, that stories actually matter more than features and the specifications and then the engineering. And I think probably there's a sympathetic audience to this kind of thing, that the framing, the context, the way in which something that you develop is described and put into a format that makes it legible to people matters almost much more than the kind of technology and what accelerometer you're using or what version of the Arduino firmware goes in there, or all those kinds of things that typically, I think in an earlier sort of incarnation of technology, maybe mattered more. So sometimes you'll pick up a box or something, and you'll look at, okay, what are the features and specs? If you're going down the list, Wi-Fi, okay, looks good. But often, more than not, you would not have picked up that box if there were not a story around it that compelled you, that drove you to that. And whatever that story might be, it might be just a really seductive bit of advertising. It might be an experience that a friend had, and it's sort of framed in a way that says, like, I could use that. And chances are, unless you're super geeky, your friend didn't come up and say, it's got 8 of 211 pins. You're going to want to get rid of this. So just another example, Jurassic Park's another favorite. I spent a lot of time on Jurassic Park and Jurassic Park science when I was doing my doctorate work. And what I found most interesting about the film is that the ways in which you get Steven Spielberg together with Michael Crichton together with, what's his name? Famous paleontologist or infamous paleontologist. So these three come together, and they're going to, Steven Spielberg's going to visually present Michael Crichton's quite compelling story. Michael Crichton's story is basically providing an alternative thesis as to the structural anatomy of dinosaurs. And this is that paleontologist whose name I forgot. Maybe someone can Google him. His from the woods, right angle, counter to common held doctrine about how what dinosaurs are and how they behave and all those kinds of things. He has his thesis essentially propagated through the film and through all the ancillary stuff that happened around the film. And some of that ancillary stuff includes silicon graphics. They made a special computer that had special processing power to do all the tricky visual special effects, and they kind of took advantage of that in a way, sort of linking their engineering work, which I believe is real. I mean, there's a company there I can go knock on the door, and they're saying that we're helping to build dinosaurs. It's just a clever bit of advertising. But even more sort of in a sort of popular mode, you get these wonderful things, like my favorite Time magazine cover, because it collapses essentially three things that are going on around the film and about dinosaurs. First of all, they're going to tell us about the making of Spielberg's Jurassic Park, film about dinosaurs. Then they're going to tell us the truth about dinosaurs, because it was all wrong before. And surprise, just about everything you believe is wrong. So this loop right through that, what you thought before is wrong, through this thing about, okay, the truth, big bold letters, we're going to tell you what the real deal is, and then the film, by the way. Because the film, in a way, is what they're suggesting, is it is the visual representation of that scientific truth that before was something else that isn't right anymore. And so this idea, so just getting more abstract about it, something that David calls a diegetic prototype, and I'll just read this for you. It says, cinematic depictions of future technologies are actually diegetic prototypes. So diegetic basically means the moment of the story, the unfolding of the story, that demonstrate to large public audiences that technologies need benevolence and viability. I show how diegetic prototypes have a major rhetorical advantage over truth prototypes. In the diegesis, these technologies exist as real objects that function properly and which people actually use. So just to unpack that a little bit, stories matter in designing the future. What David is saying that you can spend all the time you want in your basement lab and cobbling together a light bulb that lasts for 300 years, but unless there's a story around it, unless there's a way in which you can make that legible to people so that they can bring it into their world and they can understand it in a comprehensive way, it doesn't matter. And the extreme example of Jurassic Park, I think, captures that quite well in the sense that maybe the public didn't even really care about the difference between dinosaurs that may have had bird hips versus reptilian hips. But the fact that this was able to be produced in this film and that this alternative thesis was able to be presented to a widespread audience does in fact matter. And it almost comes to the point of, without, I'm not going to float away because gravity's going to stop, but the fact that facts are made in the moment of their telling as a story. So you can say as long as you want that gravity exists, if I tell you that it's actually string beans that are holding the ground, it doesn't matter. If I can provide a compelling story that convinces you of that, then I've done that bit of fact making. Another reason why design fiction is, I guess this is the more fun reason why design fiction is something interesting to explore, is that science fiction can do things that science fact can't. So you can present things, you can show dinosaurs on a screen that you wouldn't have been able to do, obviously, for most intents and purposes, in real life, despite the fact that scientists are trying to do that. And a lot of this happens in a DIY way. So Star Trek is a great example of the ways in which the things that we imagine are brought to light, and brought to light in quite an epic way. So if you do a quick whatever kind of search you prefer, Bing, Google, whatever, of Star Trek fan art, you get absolutely amazing things that people put together that do not exist whatsoever in the universe of Gene Roddenberry's authorized Star Trek. And the fact that fans take these things to a different level and reimagine and recreate and add on to the world of what that Star Trek science fiction is absolutely fascinating. There are all kinds of really interesting examples. I won't. So this is the Dark Knight, and there's this this moment of film you probably remember when the mobile phones are being used as I forget the technical term, but basically like sonar. So they're able to, with millions of these mobile phones out there, image the world based on bouncing sound off of things and bringing it back, and basically doing what effectively, when it's explained in the film. Films always have these kind of didactic moments where they're like, "Whoa, how'd you do that?" Well, let me explain. And they kind of take you into the world and they're doing that bit of creative work and making the thing legible. And so Morgan Freeman's character does this at this moment. He says, like, "You've turned my sonar project into a high-resolution visualizer." And Batman's like, "Yes, I have." And just to reflect upon like that kind of crosstalk. So there are a bunch of things going on at this moment. One is, if you're aware of it, if you're so it's a limited audience, but there are people who will be like, "Wow, yeah, that's what the kind of MediaCom people have been like kind of talking about." Like the whole surveillance thing. Like there are all these sensors out there now. Eric talked about this stuff. What happens if you aggregate that stuff? Well, good things, but also maybe this bad news thing. So not taking a side on that controversy, it's just this point that something that is in circulation in the real world is reflected and presented in the film. And what I think is probably one of the more sort of compelling articulations of that bit of nervousness about ubiquitous sensing and surveillance cameras and all that other kind of stuff. Probably, to me, it's much more interesting than reading a study or a report or God bless them, academic paper on this topic. And it just captures it in this very short 2.5-minute sequence. But the crosstalk, because it's messy and the world is messy, and I'm not trying to frame things in a perfect way. So there's UbiComp involved in that. There's Christopher Nolan, who did Batman. So he's involved in some way. The visual effects people, the production designers, all these things come together in this messy moment. And then there also, before that was Ben Rubin's listening post, which I don't know if there's a direct, I don't know if a production designer was like, hey, I saw that at San Jose Museum of Art. It's kind of a good pen. I think I'll use that in both now. But the idea of this kind of ubiquitous visualization, representation of the world going on is also sort of summarized in this moment. And it's really much less interesting to be like, talk about precedents and who was there first, as opposed to in that kind of level playing field. Their ideas exist between people. And if there was one thing when I was teaching that was maybe one of the most difficult things to teach students, besides a whole bunch of other things like doing your work, was they would come up with ideas like, oh, hey, I got this great idea. And they'd run through it and be like, that's great. You hear a couple of links to some prior art, and they'd be like, did someone else did it? And this idea that, we're original art, the idea that we come up with doesn't exist anywhere else. If you have an idea, 10 billion other people have had the same idea. Chances are. There's the idea is to think of not of yourself as existing as sort of plane of precedence, like I was a leader and I was the first one to do it, and look at all these great things I followed from my good work, as opposed to the ideas that circulate and in a messy way bump and grind up against and swerve into each other in really creative, artistic, and clever ways. Some more examples of this kind of interesting crosstalk. So 2001, another great science fiction film that happened at this wonderful moment when during the space race. So 2001 came out in 1968, and of course Neil Armstrong landed on the moon in 1969, is that right? According to the decade? December 1969? July 17th. July 17th.
They're sitting in front of Google.
So the interesting thing about that was, this wonderful molten moment, and it's out of print, but if you can find this book called The Making of 2001, absolutely pick it up. Pick up as many copies as you can, because it describes all the again, it's like the wires, like seeing everything as it's going on, and you get the production notes and discussions and interviews with people afterwards when Kubrick was trying to make the film, and Asimov was working with him, and they're trying to figure out how they're going to do this, how they're going to make this representation that is true to form. So it's not, they don't want to do foam moons. And Kubrick wants to go to exhaustive means and just with excruciating detail represent what it would be like to travel from the Earth to Jupiter. How would it work? What would be the technology? What would the materials in the spaceship look like? What is this new technology that might exist? What might it be? And he even went to the point, there's a wonderful story about how he was working in his East Village studio in New York City, and Asimov called him up and was like, there are these two guys, they're at the whatever hotel. I really think that we should meet with them. And he went to go, it was a blinding snowstorm kind of thing, epic story. He goes to meetings, he said, sit down and talk, and it turns out that there are these two rocket scientists, because there were those things back then, and they were literally having the same sorts of problems that Kubrick was, to the point where the level of their engagement with the material was as peers. So Kubrick wasn't like, I don't know, an explosion or two, I'm thinking about this. He was really talking in detail about the work he was doing, to the point where he hired them to be involved in the project, and they saw it in these interviews that have been mapped. They saw it as an opportunity for them to work through some of the issues and problems of the space travel. So they had this opportunity to use the production moment of the film as a way to work through and articulate their ideas. And one of my favorite examples of how this kind of comes into play is these interfaces that you see in the ships. This is the moon shuttle as it's landing on the moon in the early, I think the first act of the film. And so we look at this now and we say like, well, yeah, they just got a graphical user interface for their computer. There was no such thing. There were no graphical user interfaces for computers in 1968. So thinking up how people might interact with and how they might behave in front of it, and what kinds of ways in which they might articulate computers, which are, back then, I mean, computers were things that were in the basement, and they were run by one company, and that was it. So this idea that there might be computer modules existing in different places was highly speculative, to the point where Kubrick actually talked to Lloyd's of London to try to take out insurance against the possibility that something went wrong, either went wrong with the Apollo mission, so it's a disaster, so people got totally turned off of space travel, and they're like, well, I'm not going to go see these guys travel in space in this film. Or if there was something that happened in the space mission that made a part of the fiction that he was creating improbable or unlikely or more speculative than he was comfortable with. They never come to policy very well. Another example, so Eric dug up his little secret manual. I found this in my folks' house, Starfleet Technical Manual, which was a horrible embarrassment to buy when I was, 13 or something like that. But now it's like, I find it to be like an epic resource for all kinds of wonderful material. So just the short story behind this guy, Franz Joseph, was a aerospace, essentially draftsman, back before they had, like CAD plotters to draw out their diagrams of all the aerospace that was going on in Southern California in the 60s and 70s. And he basically used his draftsman skill to draw the, essentially the schematics and the outlines, the engineering drawings of all this great material that exists in Star Trek. So like tricorders and communicators and bridge decks, what's the layout, what's the cut angle of this particular thing. The detail that I'm sure many of the props people who did this stuff didn't think too hard about. They just kind of got some wood together and they kind of put the thing together. But he went back and said, this stuff is real, I'm going to do the engineering diagram for it. And he just did it on his own. And he went to Gene Roddenberry and said, look, I'm working on this project. I just want to let you know that it's going on and, get your sort of blessing or whatever. And Gene Roddenberry thought it was absolutely fantastic, to the point where he sent props and said, this might help you with your diagram. Here's some of the props that we used for the things, put some measurements, stuff like that. I just recently went to this Star Trek exhibit at Hollywood and Highland in Los Angeles. Completely cheesy, but it was definitely worth it. And you look at the props and you're kind of like, oh, that just ruined it for me. Because you see like split lines, you see like where the paint's chipped and those kinds of things. But he took this and made this kind of stuff real. And it was so popular that it actually got on the New York Times bestseller list, along with Helter Skelter. And this was 1976, and it was the kind of thing like before, like big companies could track the level of interest by fans in their work. So now they do that on the Google, or they've got stats or analysts who go out and do it. That people at Paramount were like, whoa, what's this about? What's going on? And actually, the story goes that the popularity of this, plus the conventions that were happening, encouraged Paramount to go ahead and sort of, after, there was just 3 seasons of Star Trek existed, to go ahead and think about, start doing pre-production for a film. So here's some of the drawings he did. Here's a hand phaser, and then on the right is early stage of a plastic print of a colleague of mine who's actually making a hand phaser. It's going to work. The tricorder, which is just, this is beautiful. You can't make this stuff up. It's no surface mount, of course not. It's just like all these discrete components bulging out of the and a cathode ray tube. Here's the communicator, which is all the wonderful stories about how the communicator tipped into what mobile phones came to. I'll talk about that in a moment. That's the antenna cover for a communicator that my colleague Andrew Buttrell was making. He made it. It actually works. He gave me one, which is a wonderful gift. Here's the schematic for the communicator. I was absolutely convinced. 13-year-old, Radio Shack, soldering iron, done. So this gets back to this point about the diegetic prototype, or props, kind of a loose, slippery word. I like this quote, David Kirby turned me on to this. Space may be the final frontier, but it's made in the Hollywood basement. And that kind of gets to the substance of this idea of how we invent the worlds that we want to inhabit in the future. And this idea that there's a slippery line between the world of science fact and science fiction. And in fact, I think it's much more useful to think of it as a free-flowing conduit back and forth. And so a lot of the things that I'm sure people here make or think of or want to make have a particular point of view about how the world is and how it behaves and how it operates. So We were talking in my workshop the other day about a number of projects, a project that Tom Hume and Matt Jones did at Nokia. It's called Twitcher. They basically use Bluetooth IDs to sense the existence of the Bluetooth devices around, but then they flip that on its head and turned it into a world of birds that are just flying around. So each Bluetooth ID is represented a bird. And you guys know about these kinds of projects, and the bit of mystery that they're doing is, in a way, an effective form of fictionalizing that material world that we usually understand as like, oh, well, that's just my computer mouse, it's not a bird. But it's like, let's just play for a minute. Let's turn it on its head and see what the world looks like from a different angle. And that's a lot of what science fiction usually does. And its most productive moment, its most, I guess, political moment, Frederick Jameson wrote quite eloquently about this, is when it is able to do that political act of showing how the world could be different. And it's able to do it. It's probably the only form of literature that's able to do that by saying things are going to be different, and we know that from the get-go. So you're investing your time and your energy and your sort of cognitive framework into letting go of things and seeing how things might be sometimes just a little bit different, but sometimes quite a great deal different. I should quickly, this is the communicator. I sort of wish I had brought it, but it would kind of be like bringing like an artifact from Tutankhamun's tomb or something, because it's so, I mean, it's durable and it's precious and like that, but it was made at great expense. So this is the Nokia phone from the future. And it works, fully functional. It's got a SIM card in it, can make phone calls. Does little star tracking noises, which is absolutely wonderful. And what I learned most, I think, from Andrew and his work and the way he works is that, first of all, he's exceptionally competent in terms of taking an idea and expressing it and rendering it and producing the material. So he will go from an idea to its embodiment in material form, usually quite quickly and usually quite with exceptional creative skill and acumen. So you can work the CNC machine, you can work in CAD, you can work in all the other sides of the material. So communicating the idea visually, it all comes across quite well. And that's one thing. It's one talent that I think is absolutely crucial for the manufacturer of these visions, is being able to take it from idea to its embodied form, and more than just, it was mentioned, people in my workshop didn't say this a zillion times, it's not just enough to say, wouldn't it be cool if? You have to go that next step and fill in that ellipsis and answer that question. Well, I don't know, but let's try it out. Let's make it happen. Let's make it work, and let's put it in a form that's expressive enough that people can take it and say, well, feels about right. I'll kind of hold on to this for a little while and see how it feels in the hand, and move forward from that, just that speculation. If you haven't seen this film, you must. It's like $5 or something on Amazon. It's completely cheesy, while also tongue-in-cheek, which makes it okay. And it's basically William Shatner kind of terrassing around the world in a Rolls Royce, and meeting up with people whose worlds have been changed by Star Trek. And these are people who are doing real kinds of things. So there's the doctor who's like, when I was a kid, I saw McCoy's sick bay, and it's like, I don't want to do that. That's what I want to do. And they talk to someone with Google, help me out, just basically again, the guy from Motorola who invented the mobile phone. Can't remember his name. Talk to him about how he was very much, that idea of having this personal communications in the hand was something that was sort of out there, but it was encouraged or moved along with these other visions that people could point to and say, hey, look, I sort of thought about this, but they kind of capture that idea quite well in this Star Trek communicator thing. So then there's this question about why do we mix and muddle design, science, fact, and fiction? And just from it's a more articulate response than shrug, it's kind of cool, is it's really valuable to explain and to imagine, but then also to materialize ideas. And like I said, science fiction as a literary form and as a visual story form does that really, really well. In most, many instances. I mean, bad science fiction is just going to be bad science fiction. But even the bad stuff, there's that completion of the act of like, I have this idea of how a world could be. I'm just going to put it down on paper, or I'm going to create a film that shows that particular world. And making that move and sort of doing that bit of work, I think, what I'm trying to say is analogous to what happens in these communities, in DIY. So I am doing it myself. What am I doing? I'm creating a world that I've imagined, and now I'm just sort of putting it down in code and a little bit of wiring and maybe some material and fabric, and I'm going to put these things together, and there it is. There's my bit of speculative fiction about what the world might be like. Just this little corner. And this corner fits in my pocket, and that's all that I was trying to do. Not a vision about an entirely different new world from end to end, although maybe, but just that little germ, that seed of an idea. And often I find, creatively in my own practice, that just starting from that question of like, well, what would the world look like from over there? Or what would the world look like if SMS didn't stand for short messaging service, but it stands for slow messaging service? And then going and rather than just speculating about it or theorizing about it, putting it down in work and start, getting out and the solders out there and figuring out how you would do that. And all the things that happen and then you discover and you find out when you're going through the work of cobbling the material to make it happen. So, all the stuff that you have to go through in order to learn how to use a component. So like reading spec sheets, but trying to find a way to read them not as tedium, but as the real source material for the work that you're doing. And thinking of them as part of your composition of this kind of bit of science fiction work. A lot of them read like science fiction, that's what it is. And so this idea that it's useful to think of, for instance, P.K. Dick as a system administrator. So you pick up P.K. Dick or Bruce Sterling or William Gibson or Charlie Strauss or whoever your favorite science fiction author is, and say, like, this is actually a real world. And I'm going to pull moments of this real world and wonder what would it take for the world to go from where it is now to where it is in this fictional moment. And taking it as almost like a bit as a kind of specification sheet. So the world now has these things called whatever it is. And wonder what that world would look like and how you would make that thing and all that bit of work that goes into actually materializing it. And so, so there are insights we have when you read Bruce Sterling as software documentation. So this isn't just a story, but it's actually describing how the world behaves in a very material way, much more like something more literal than the science fiction that it is. And I think it helps to think of science fiction props, so all those objects, as in a way conclusions to today's engineering prototypes. So the way in which an idea moves from something happening in the lab into the real world, moving back even before the lab or alongside the lab in a way, and looking at the ways in which science fiction or those early explorations are part of that conversation that leads to that conclusion where the world now has mobile phones with touch or whatever it might be, or a world that now has Google Street View, anticipated in conversation with working alongside of this work that Michael Neymark did 30 years before. And so this idea about seeing things from other points of view and mobile technology and mobile phones, there's, the last thing I want to show you is just a bit of in my own way, sort of a bit of speculation into how you do that maneuver of looking at the world in a different way. And it's super low tech. And I think that there's something quite fascinating with being low tech or untech or just kind of using material around and looking at the world in a different way. And for the probably like 3 people here who read my blog, because there are only 7 people in the world who do, you might have noticed, this is what insight is, you might have noticed that the blog took a little bit of a swerve, because it was like for years where I was showing a lot of DIY technology stuff. So here's how you wire this up to this, and this is what I think it means. And that's where I realized that just probably because I was doing that, there was a core audience. So those 7 people were always going to those pages just to basically get instructions on how to hook something up to something else. And there was a moment where I kind of swerved from that, basically when I joined this design studio, and the swerve happened because I realized I was going back to school anyway. So learning about how to bring these sets of skills together, engineering, technology, sort of art technology stuff that I got involved in. I was learning now how to add design into that and thinking about the work I was doing with different sensibilities. So for the last couple of years, I've been mostly thinking about this other perspective. So it's not less about building things and more about wondering what the world might look like from these different vantage points. And so there was an embodiment of that, a project that I did recently where I was just curious. I'm very curious about mobile flows and movement through cities. And a lot of people who work in mobile technology, that's one aspect of the world that they're quite interested in. And so I built this giant pole that would just allow me to do this one simple thing, which is to see the world from another point of view. So just shifting perspective in a very literal way, and shifting it in a literal but also kind of slight way. So initially I was just very interested in seeing, capturing another point of view as to the flow of pedestrians in urban space. And I could have done with technology and all kinds of other stuff. I just wanted a roll of video that allowed me to see that, and then maybe I would go on and chew on later. So found one of those poles that those sign changers use to change the gas price signs, which that's another project. And put a couple of wide field of view cameras on it. It's very cheap, relatively cheap cameras that, there's a whole community of people who just put cameras on helmets and fall off of things and jump off of things and that sort of thing, and show their friends and have a laugh. Use a couple of those and put them on the top of this pole, and then capture these points of views at different locations where I thought the urban flow, the pedestrian flow was quite interesting. And what I wanted to do was not so much see those flows, but do that bit of perspective changing. So make things look a little bit different than they normally do. They look different, first of all, because you've seen it from above, but then try to do something else. And so I'll just show you, this is a video that I did. It's split funny because I'm just a guy cobbling things together, and the cameras, I didn't use lasers to align them or anything like that, so they're kind of roughly split. I turn it into a little bit of a bit. I wear my new Future Laboratory kind of custodian's costume, which is just gray dickies, so just kind of, people don't pay attention to me because I'm just fixing something or whatever it might be. And then just going through different spots. So this is a Penn Station, the entrance on 6th Avenue in New York City. And I wanted to see what these flows look like. And I knew that on the left, you're seeing basically just, that's it, that's what the flow looks like. And then on the right, what I wanted to do was bring to the foreground, essentially, things that don't move. So turn what urban flow is kind of on its head in a way, and allow you to pay attention to the things that normally don't draw our eyes to them because, well, I mean, it could be any number of reasons, but typically in a place like this, you're moving, so you don't stop and look and see what's going on. But also, I think, maybe it's part of just like a sensory apparatus, we notice things that move more than we notice things that aren't moving. So that might be that whole reptilian, like, what's going on? But in this moment, I wanted to, I was just curious, like who moves and who doesn't, and why don't they, and why do that? Despite the fact that I was sitting there for several minutes, nervously doing this, I'm wondering when Homeland Security was going to show up. I did notice the two guys that you see on the left. One's on a little BMX bike, and the other guy's just kind of talking to him. No idea what they're doing, but they didn't move the whole time. And after I left them, they were probably still there. And then you get these moments where it's like, the kind of meet up where people are discussing like, what are we going to do, or which way are we going to go, or I don't love you anymore, I'm out of here, or whatever's going on. And those kind of encounters that happen, that kind of the friction and bump of these kind of tight spaces where people are trying to make their way out and just trying to get where they're going. And to me, it was just this kind of very lovely way of representing these moments of urban flow. And another way of capturing the things that I think I've been trying to capture or describe or articulate or express to people about the importance of understanding flow in these urban mobile contexts in ways that I think are hard to do if you spend a lot of time trying to cobble together a lot of sophisticated technology to put it together. I mean, maybe I'm wrong. But there is also something, because I've been trying to find new ways of communicating the work that I do, again, in ways that are more legible to people other than just the communities that immediately going to get it, because they're going to be like, oh yeah, I know what you're doing. So you're doing some of this stuff. Is the thing about using the visual medium as a way to communicate that. I am no Spielberg, and I don't aspire to be, but I admire him and people like him who are able to make these spectacular visual stories that I think communicate, as I described earlier, these visions of new possible worlds much, much more effectively than any engineer or scientist. And God bless us, many artists are able to do it. And the idea that you can, it's probably one of the most important things that you do when you're kind of inventing the future, is to provide a point of entry, a pathway for people to understand and comprehend this vision that you have, so they can engage in a conversation about it. So they can say like, yeah, that's cool, I understand what you're saying, or even if you refer to it and say like, it's kind of like this, and providing those metaphorical or literal links to other things that they might be aware of. This guy's one of my favorite guys. He kind of stops there and he's trying to figure out, what.
How does it remain so still? Do you?
The pole?
Yeah.
I'm just like a
Like a feel like a pillow.
Did anybody say anything to you?
Oh yeah, that was actually, it became like probably the more interesting part. Well, I mean, it's all interesting, but the unexpected, wonderful part is all the things that people came up and they said or asked. One guy, you know, absolutely, was a scruffy guy, kind of ragamuffy, and you wouldn't have expected this from him, but really articulate conversation with him about urban sociology. Like he was, I don't know, like scruffy, maybe he was a professor or something, but he was like, to the person who screeched up, you know, the hipster, screeched up on his fixie, and he's like, hey, you from Google? Mostly people are just kind of, you know, they're just kind of curious, and they look and they're kind of like, hey, that's kind of cool. Like, where are you going to put that up, or those kinds of things. There were a bunch, because I was walking around the city with it, and it's even collapsed. It's about 8 feet, so it's a bit awkward and moving feet. And there are people who are like, hey, it's got a fucking camera on there. Like it's a problem. So that's that. I promised, so this is for people who are in my workshop, I promised you that I put the reader that I put together and the presentations online, so that's the URL in case you can get it in the workshop, and I just, both of those are uploaded. And there's more at that URL on the bottom, which is a longer essay around this topic. So,
We'll build that out.
cool. Thanks a lot.